All right, so we're diving deep into the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms today.
Sounds exciting.
Yeah, and you've sent over a whole bunch of material.
I have. I'm really excited about this one.
Textbook excerpts and study guides,
Yeah.
and even a video lecture. So someone's been hitting the books.
Definitely. I have.
Okay, so before we really get into it, maybe just as a quick reminder, can you remind me what exactly is the Charter? Like, what is this document that seems to have everybody so excited?
The Charter is actually a part of the Canadian Constitution,
Oh, okay.
which is essentially the highest law in the land.
So that means all other laws have to sort of agree with it.
Exactly. Every other law has to line up with what the Charter says.
Makes sense.
Yeah, it guarantees certain rights and freedoms to everybody in Canada.
Okay.
Regardless of whether they are citizens or not, there are a couple of exceptions, which we'll get to later.
Okay, interesting.
Yeah, so it's a pretty big deal.
So it's the ultimate rule book. It lays down the law.
Exactly.
But from what I've been reading, life before the Charter was a very different story.
Oh, absolutely.
Those textbook excerpts on pre-Charter Canada were
Yeah,
pretty eye-opening.
I can imagine.
Yeah.
What stood out to you?
Well, it's pretty hard to believe that there was a time when, like, the government could actually tell you what you could wear or prohibit, like cultural ceremonies, or even detain you,
Oh, yeah.
like just because of your background.
Yeah.
Like, it's kind of shocking that that ever happened in Canada.
It really is a different time, and those historical injustices are really important
Yeah, absolutely.
for understanding why we need a charter.
For sure. It's like,
Yep.
it's kind of scary to think that those things happened, but it really highlights why we need this.
Absolutely.
So let's maybe get into it then and talk about how this is structured. Like, how is the Charter actually structured?
So the charter is organized into 7 different categories of rights.
7. Oh,
Yeah, we have fundamental freedoms,
Yeah.
democratic rights, mobility rights, legal rights, equality rights, official language rights, and minority language education rights.
that's a lot to unpack.
It is.
Where should we even start?
Well, I think a great place to start would be fundamental freedoms.
Okay.
Those are the core principles that basically allow us to live authentically and engage in society without the fear of like arbitrary government interference.
Right.
So things like freedom of expression,
Yeah.
freedom of religion, freedom of peaceful assembly.
So if I'm like up late debating online or like peacefully protesting something I care about, the Charter's got my back.
Exactly. It ensures that you have that right to express yourself,
Okay.
to practice your faith, to gather with others who share your views.
Interesting.
Those are really essential for a vibrant
Yeah.
and democratic society.
But I'm guessing there are limits.
Right.
Of course. You're absolutely right.
Like, you can't just do whatever you want and there are no consequences.
Exactly. It's not a free-for-all.
Right.
The Charter does recognize that rights aren't absolute.
There are certain situations where limitations can be placed on freedoms,
Okay.
but those limits have to be justified.
Right.
And they have to be reasonable.
But it's about finding that balance, though.
Exactly.
Ah.
Between individual liberties and the needs of society as a whole.
So this whole like reasonable limits concept, this is like pretty fascinating to me, especially like with everything that's going on these days about freedom of expression.
Yeah, it's an important one.
Like, how do we even define what's reasonable?
That's where the courts come in.
Oh, okay.
They play a crucial role in interpreting the charter
Okay.
and deciding whether or not a limit on a particular right is actually justified or not.
Oh, that's interesting.
It's a complex process, but it involves weighing a lot of different factors,
Yeah.
including things like the nature of the right,
Okay.
the severity of the limitation,
Okay.
and the potential harm that that limit is meant to prevent.
So it's not just like,
No.
a free-for-all.
Exactly.
There's actual legal stuff, reasoning and considerations involved.
Absolutely.
That's so interesting.
Do you have any examples in mind?
I mean, like, I'm just thinking about like how this would play out in real life. Like, is there a case
Oh, of course.
that comes to mind?
There are so many examples. I think one that is really, well, it might bring back some memories,
Oh.
but the 2011 Vancouver riots
Oh, yeah.
after the Canucks lost the Stanley Cup.
Oh, how could I forget?
That was all over the news.
Wild.
So, peaceful assembly is a protected, right,
Right.
under the charter.
Yeah.
But when it comes to, destructive behavior that harms others or their property,
Yeah.
that crosses the line. And the courts actually determined that those actions went way beyond
Yeah.
the acceptable bounds of protest,
Right.
and the penalties that were given were justified.
Okay. Yeah. That makes sense.
So it's really about understanding that balance.
Yeah, it's not just about like having a right, but it's about understanding like where it ends and where other people's begin.
Exactly. And it's the court's job to kind of figure that out.
That's kind of a tough job.
It is a tough job.
Okay, so we've talked about the courts, but how does this actually work in practice? Like, if someone is using this to challenge a law or to protect their rights, how does that actually play out?
Well, there are so many cases.
Yeah, is there one
that we could
that comes to mind?
Yeah, one really compelling example is the Big M Drug Mart case.
Okay.
They challenged the Lord's Day Act.
Oh,
back in the 1980s.
What's the Lord's Day Act?
So that law basically forced businesses to close on Sundays.
What?
In honor of the Christian Sabbath.
So you're telling me Sunday shopping wasn't a thing?
It wasn't always a thing.
Wow. My weekend routine would be completely thrown off.
Right.
Yeah.
It seems so strange now.
Yeah.
But at that time, it was a huge point of contention.
Right.
The Supreme Court actually ended up ruling that that law was a violation of freedom of religion.
Oh, wow.
Guaranteed by the charter.
Interesting.
Because it basically imposed one religion's observance on everyone.
Right.
Regardless of their own personal beliefs.
Wow. So they used the charter to like overturn this old law.
Exactly. And that's one of the really fascinating things about the charter.
Wow. Has that much power?
It does. It's a living document, which means it's not set in stone.
Okay.
It's constantly being interpreted and applied to new situations as society changes. And that is what makes it so relevant to your life today.
That's really interesting.
It's really a powerful tool for challenging injustice and pushing for greater equality.
That makes me think about something else I was looking at, like the no-fly list.
Oh, yeah.
That seems like such a tricky issue.
It is a really tricky one.
Like you need security, but then you also have like people who might be barred from flying just based on suspicion.
Right.
So that seems a little unfair.
That's a really great example of the tension that we often see between individual rights and national security. You know, concerns about fairness, the presumption of innocence, even the right to travel.
Right, yeah.
All those came up.
So it's like this ethical dilemma.
Exactly.
Like how do you protect people from harm, but also protect individual rights?
It is a really complex question with no easy answers.
Right.
And it's actually one that the Charter compels us to grapple with.
That's interesting.
It requires us to debate these things, to consider different perspectives, and ultimately to make tough decisions that uphold both our values and our security.
Wow. That's a lot.
It is a lot.
To consider.
It is.
Okay.
But it's important.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Okay, great.
Good stuff.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Thanks so much.
You're welcome.
Okay, so we've talked about balancing security and individual rights.
Right.
But the Charter also deals with equality, right?
It does.
You mentioned a pay equity case before.
I did.
That really caught my attention.
Yeah.
The one where the Charter was used to like fight for fairness in the workplace.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
It was really inspiring to read about.
Yeah, and that's a landmark case that really demonstrates the power that the Charter has to address systemic discrimination.
So I remember correctly, the law about equal pay for work of equal value.
Yeah.
That was already in place, right?
It was, yeah, the law was there.
But it wasn't really being used properly.
Right, it wasn't being properly implemented.
So as I was reading in the interview with Mary Kelly, she was talking about how like women, especially in fields that are like dominated by women, they were still getting paid a lot less than men for doing the same work.
Exactly.
And she was a community care worker. And it was so frustrating for her to see this gap,
right,
even though there was a law.
And she decided to do something about it.
Yeah, she did. So she, along with 3 other women in Ontario and a few labor unions, they launched this charter challenge in 2001, I believe, to say that the province wasn't living up to its own law.
That's right.
I mean, that must have taken a lot of courage.
Absolutely. A real David versus Goliath situation.
Yeah. What happened next?
Well, they were successful even before the case went to trial.
Really?
The Ontario government agreed to a $414 million settlement.
What? $414 million?
Yes.
It's huge.
It was a massive victory for those women.
Wow.
And a big step forward for pay equity in Ontario.
That's such a powerful statement, I mean.
It really is.
To see that kind of money, that's...
And that case set a precedent for how the Charter can be used to address these kinds of inequalities in the workplace.
It wasn't just about the money, though, right?
Oh, exactly.
It was about, like, recognizing the value of women's work.
Absolutely.
And making sure they're treated fairly.
Exactly. Being treated fairly and with dignity.
It makes you wonder if this was happening in Ontario.
Yeah.
Like how many other provinces have these issues?
That's a really great question. It makes you think about how much systemic discrimination is still out there
Yeah.
and how we can use the Charter to challenge those injustices.
We've seen how the charter can be used to overturn old laws
Yeah.
and even create new ones.
Yeah.
But what happens when the government wants to limit our rights?
Oh, that's a good point.
Like in an emergency,
Yeah.
like I was reading of the War Measures Act
Yes.
that was used during the World Wars
Mhm.
and the FLQ crisis.
Right. So that was a really intense period in Canadian history.
Yeah, it was a bit scary to think about.
Yeah. And the War Measures Act allowed the government to temporarily suspend certain rights
Wow.
in the name of national security. So you can imagine that raised a lot of concerns
Right.
about like overreach and the erosion of our civil liberties.
Yeah, to be living in a time where the government can just like restrict your freedoms.
It's a very difficult thing.
Yeah, but like the charter acknowledges that there are times when limits are necessary.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. Especially in emergencies. But there's a high bar for justifying those limits.
Okay, so there are still safeguards in place.
Absolutely. Even in times of crisis.
Okay.
The Charter provides protection.
So even during an emergency, they can't just do whatever they want.
Exactly. The government has to demonstrate a clear and present danger
Right.
to justify limiting those rights, and any restrictions have to be justified and proportionate to the threat.
Okay, so it's not like they could just overreact.
No knee-jerk reactions.
Okay.
Their actions have to be reasonable.
Okay, and necessary.
Exactly.
So they can't abuse their power.
No, and even if they invoke these emergency powers,
Yeah.
those actions can still be reviewed by the courts.
Oh, okay.
So the courts can examine whether what the government did was actually justified
Right.
and if it aligns with the Charter.
That's good. So we still have that protection.
We do.
It really reinforces that the charter is not just a list of rights.
Right.
It's like a framework for a society that values freedom and fairness,
That's the rule of law.
even when things get tough.
Absolutely.
So it's not just about like what you're entitled to.
Right.
It's about like your connection to this nation and your responsibility.
Absolutely.
Okay, so you mentioned earlier that there are a couple of exceptions to who gets full charter protection.
Right.
Can you remind me what those are again?
So 2 rights that are specifically granted to Canadian citizens
Yeah.
are the right to vote
Okay.
and the right to enter and leave Canada freely.
So permanent residents and visitors,
Yes,
they still have most of the same rights,
that's right.
but those two are only for citizens.
Exactly.
So those are the ones that are kind of tied to like what it means to be Canadian.
Exactly. They're intrinsically linked to citizenship.
Okay.
Voting allows people to participate in shaping the future of their country,
Right.
which is a privilege that comes with being a citizen.
Yeah.
And the right to enter and leave Canada freely
Yeah.
is connected to belonging to the country and not being subject to deportation.
It's interesting how those two are connected to what it means to be a citizen.
It's not just what you're entitled to, but
Right.
like your connection to Canada.
Exactly.
Okay.
And it brings us back to that idea of skillful decision-making.
Right.
When we're exercising our charter rights, we need to think about the impact our actions have on other people,
Yeah.
on the community.
Yeah.
It's all about finding that balance.
So our rights come with responsibilities.
They do.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Let's talk about something a bit different.
Sure.
The online world.
Okay. Yeah.
So does the Charter apply online?
That's a really good question and one that comes up a lot,
Yeah.
especially as we spend more and more time online.
Right.
The short answer is yes.
Okay.
The charter does apply.
Even for things like freedom of expression on social media?
Even online, you have the right to express yourself,
Okay.
to share information, to connect with others.
Okay, but there have to be limits. Right.
Right, you can't just go around spreading misinformation
Right.
or harassing people online.
Yeah, you can't just say, and hide behind the Charter.
Right.
Just like in the offline world, freedom of expression is not absolute.
Okay.
You have laws against hate speech,
Yeah.
defamation, inciting violence, all of those things.
Okay.
And those apply equally online.
So again, it's about finding that balance.
Exactly.
How do we protect free speech,
Yes,
but also prevent harm?
exactly. It's definitely a challenge.
Yeah, especially with the digital landscape always changing.
Absolutely. It's something that courts and lawmakers are always working on,
Okay.
trying to keep up with technology.
So it's an ongoing thing.
It is, but the Charter is a vital tool for navigating all of this
Yeah.
and making sure that our rights are respected in the digital age.
Well, it's amazing how this document is still so relevant.
It is.
Even though it was written way before the internet.
I know, it really speaks to the wisdom of the people who drafted it.
Yeah.
They understood that the principles of freedom and equality and justice, those are timeless.
Okay, so we've covered a lot. History, types of rights, how it's used.
It's been a journey.
And how it applies to, like, the internet.
Yeah.
It's pretty incredible how this touches on so many things in our lives.
It really is a cornerstone of Canadian society.
Yeah.
It shapes our laws, our institutions, even how we interact with each other.
Right.
It's a reminder that we live in a country that values individual rights and freedoms.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Okay, well, thanks so much for taking the time.
It was my pleasure.
Yeah, it was really interesting to hear about all this.
Glad you enjoyed it.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Okay, so we've really explored the Charter, like all the way from its roots to like how it's used today.
Absolutely.
But before we wrap things up,
I
kind of wanted to pose like a thought-provoking question.
Okay.
Imagine you were like writing the Charter today.
Okay.
Knowing what we know now.
Yeah.
What would you change?
Oh, that's a really good question.
Right.
Yeah.
Would you add anything?
It's a tough one. It really challenges us to think critically about the Charter.
Right.
And how it can adapt as the world changes.
Yeah, for sure. Like, we've come a long way since 1982.
We have.
I mean, think about the internet and social media.
Absolutely.
Climate change.
Yeah.
Even data privacy.
Yeah.
Are there any rights or freedoms that are, like, missing?
Well, maybe something like a right to digital privacy.
Okay, yeah.
That would protect our personal data online.
Or how about, like, a right to a healthy environment?
Oh, that's a good one.
You know?
Yeah.
To recognize how connected we are to nature.
Those are just a couple of examples.
Yeah.
But they showed that the Charter isn't static.
Right.
It can evolve as our understanding of like freedom and justice changes.
It's like a conversation that's always going on.
Exactly.
I get it from the people before us.
Yeah.
And then we kind of shape it for the people who come after.
And that's what makes being an active citizen so important.
Right.
Questioning things, considering different views.
Yeah, it's not just a document. It's like our values and hopes all in one place.
Exactly.
So we've learned a lot about the Charter today.
Yeah, we have.
You know, your rights, the history, and how it works in real life.
Absolutely.
But it doesn't stop here.
No, the learning never ends.
The more we understand, the better we can like have these conversations.
Absolutely.
Make changes.
And shape a better society.
Exactly. Okay, so go out there and use your rights.
Yes.
But, you know, responsibly.
Of course.
Remember, knowledge is power.
It is.
Especially with something as important as the Charter.
Absolutely.
So keep those brains buzzing, and until next time, happy exploring.
Bye for now.